Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who called the police because I don't join the HOA. I've got quite the tale to share, and it all started about 3 years ago when I moved into what was supposed to be my dream mountain home. Little did I know, I was stepping into a hornet's nest of odd neighbor relationships and a seemingly omnipresent homeowners association that I never wanted to be part of in the first place. If I had known the extent of the drama lurking behind the beautiful view of pines, the fresh mountain air, and the quiet nights, I might have chosen a different spot. But here I am, telling you all about how I nearly lost my peace of mind and eventually found a silver lining after a neighbor decided to weaponize the local police over an HOA dispute, of all things. I first fell in love with the property during a weekend getaway trip. There was this tiny real estate office down in the valley that was advertising secluded mountain homes with panoramic views of the surrounding forests. I'd been saving up for years, hoping to escape the hectic city life. So, with a nice chunk of money in my savings account and a strong desire to leave behind the noise, traffic, and pollution, I jumped at the opportunity. The moment I drove up the winding road and saw the old 2-story cabin, perched at the edge of a gentle slope overlooking miles and miles of pristine woodland, I knew this was where I wanted to settle. The property had its quirks: a steep driveway, an older well system, and a bit of a tricky property boundary that curved in a strange half-moon shape around the adjacent lot. But none of that bothered me in the beginning. After finalizing the paperwork with the previous owner, who was a sweet, older gentleman, I moved in and started my new life. He and I had spent a solid afternoon going through all the unusual aspects of the place. I distinctly remember him mentioning something about the neighbor's convenience, but I hadn't thought much of it at the time. He said they occasionally used the private road that cut through our land for easier access, but I got the sense it wasn't a big deal. He described them as polite enough, though a bit persistent about neighborhood matters. About a month after I moved, I was introduced, rather abruptly I might add, to the concept of the local HOA. Some of the neighbors came by to present me with the official registration packet. I was told that even though my property was technically not part of their association's territory, due to the original development lines drawn decades ago, they encouraged all local homeowners to join. They touted the standard talking points: well-maintained roads, except they didn't maintain my road, so that was a weird pitch; communal holiday events, safety committees, and various membership perks. While they were pleasant enough at first, there was an unmistakable whiff of pushiness. I politely listened to the entire spiel but declined to sign the papers. One of these neighbors, a tall and stern-looking fellow named Lyle, took the lead in trying to get me to join. He had this almost practiced tone in his voice, as though he'd given the same lecture to numerous folks before. From what I gathered, Lyle was the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA. He arrived with an armful of forms and a suspiciously thorough knowledge of how beneficial membership could be for the entire community. I've never really had an issue with HOAs in theory, but my property was clearly outside their domain. I felt no obligation to join, especially when I found out their membership dues were quite high. And from what I'd heard around the local hardware store, the money was rarely allocated in a transparent manner. Still, I tried to keep my refusal polite. I didn't want to alienate my neighbors. After all, I was new here, but it was evident from Lyle's face that he did not handle rejection well. He gave me a tight smile, said something about how we could talk again in a few weeks, and left me with all the pamphlets. Over the next few months, I received a number of friendly reminders in my mailbox. These were typically newsletters outlining HOA happenings, invitations to pay dues, or flyers about local gatherings. Each one ended with an invitation for me to finally join the fold. I consistently ignored them, as I had made it clear I wasn't interested. My home and land were legally separate from any official HOA boundaries, and frankly, the entire concept of an HOA up in the mountains felt out of place, especially since I was told the roads that led specifically to my property were not funded by them in any way. So what was I paying for exactly? Better question: why on earth were they so interested in forcing me into this group? Fast forward a year into my new life, and I'm thoroughly enjoying my little slice of paradise. I'd started a modest vegetable garden, got to know a few local farmers, and was setting up a small workshop for woodworking. My lifelong dream. Although certain neighbors kept pushing the association agenda, many of the folks I met were genuinely pleasant and helpful, often waving at me when I drove by. My house sat at a curve in a private drive that only led to my property and to the one next door, owned by a man named James. He was the neighbor that the previous owner had referenced, the one who sometimes passed through my land for an easier exit. The official county map showed a legal easement for a short strip in front of my house that connected to James's driveway. It was a bit unusual because it meant if James wanted a direct route to the main mountain road, he needed to cut across the corner of my property. Otherwise, he'd have to circle around the mountain's back road, a steeper, longer, and far less maintained route. James introduced himself politely when I moved in. He seemed friendly and said the older owner had been happy to let him cross that short stretch of land to reach the asphalt road. I initially agreed to continue that arrangement because I saw no harm. His 20-second drive was convenient, but I didn't care. I thought it would also foster neighborliness. After some peace, I discovered that James was deeply involved in the HOA that had been bothering me. Unfortunately, he was one of the main voices encouraging other neighbors to pressure me into joining. I accidentally learned this when I stopped at a local diner for lunch and overheard two men at the counter discussing that new fellow who won't join. One was explaining how James was complaining that a neighbor so close refused membership set a bad precedent. I realized they were talking about me after a moment. I stayed quiet, but James had been saying nasty things about me to everyone, calling me cheap, untrustworthy, and too antisocial to fit into our community. I initially ignored it. Life involves talking. I don't get the gossip bug. James began telling people I was doing questionable renovations to my house that could lower property values and violate local building codes. Nothing was true. The only major renovation I did was replacing some rotted deck beams, which the county had approved. The book was followed. However, hearing that he was actively sabotaging my reputation without consulting me was unsettling. Despite my attempts, he dismissed it as a misunderstanding. It didn't seem so. After a year and a half on the mountain, HOA drama escalated. Lyle knocked on my door several times, usually with new forms or complaining that I wasn't using the HOA's amenities like the recreational center at the bottom of the mountain, which I didn't use. I calmly explained that I had no reason to join each time. I wouldn't pay for services I didn't need or receive because my property wasn't under their jurisdiction. It was getting old, and I suspected it was more than just collecting membership fees. Having everyone under one roof gave them power and control. I couldn't understand why they were so insistent, but little clues emerged over time. James's repeated land easement use started bothering me after 2 years. I didn't mind at first, but he started using that corner of my property as his driveway. His more frequent house parties, possibly HOA-related, didn't help. Guests, deliveries, and even random contractors were crossing my land more often. I saw them speeding by my window, sometimes too fast, leaving tire marks on the soft ground. I saw a small, loaded pickup truck nearly hit one of my property line's old wooden barriers once. I didn't want to be a territorial grump, but my rights were being taken away. I never allowed strangers to cross my land on repeat. To make matters worse, people were leaving trash and cigarette butts near the boundary. I posted a small sign politely requesting cleanliness. That sign vanished mysteriously after a few days. I tried to convince James to be careful and limit use to himself and family. He shrugged and said I was starting to sound paranoid. That remark hurt, but I ignored it. Next came neighborhood trashing, which I wasn't ready for. One of my friendlier neighbors told me James had been telling everyone I was unstable, fussy about unimportant details, and threatening to block the only easy way in and out of his property if I didn't get my way. The truth was completely distorted. I just wanted him to be polite. My friend advised me to record everything in case. I started taking notes, dates, times, people crossing, conflicts, and damages. It seemed silly, but I thought it might be important one day. As the 3-year mark approached, things escalated. I discovered James had intensified his smear campaign. He was spreading rumors and telling the HOA leadership that I was refusing to maintain that road, putting the community at risk. He used the road to make me look like a nuisance to get me to comply. Lyle even tried to guilt-trip me by saying I was endangering James by forcing him to take the long mountain route when the short path was unusable due to my lack of maintenance. That was my final straw. This wasn't a trusting neighborly relationship anymore. I told James face-to-face that if he publicly slandered me, he couldn't drive across my property, period. I told him we had a good thing going, but I wouldn't bend over backward for someone who was trying to ruin my reputation. He laughed at me and said, "You can't keep me off that road, buddy. I have a right to it after years of use." He didn't have a recorded easement beyond that corner, which was for essential ingress and egress, and meant for occasional use. not turning my land into a thoroughfare. The property record stated that. He claimed I had no right to block him, but the deed allowed me to limit usage to emergencies or necessity, especially if the user was damaging or misusing the land. A week passed before I decided how to proceed. The next time James tried to cross my property, I calmly reminded him that the previous owner only allowed unlimited use because they were friends. Respect seemed to underpin that relationship. From what James said, that respect was pretty broken, so I had no desire to keep the informal agreement. I made it clear I would gate off the corner if he kept lying and harassing me about the HOA. He could be a polite neighbor or take the long mountain road whenever he went out. His choice. James called me the next night furious instead of talking rationally. He accused me of abusing property laws, threatened neighborly retaliation, and promised to consult the HOA attorney. After 5 minutes of his incoherent ranting, I said, "James, this conversation is over," and hung up. 2 local police officers knocked on the door a few days later. I heard an engine approaching from the main road one afternoon while shaping pine planks for the porch in my workshop. A patrol car slowly climbed my driveway as I watched out the window. No confrontation requiring the police had ever happened in my life, so my stomach knotted. 2 officers emerged, one older and world-weary, the other younger and unsure. After politely ringing the doorbell, the older officer introduced himself and explained in an awkward tone that they had received a complaint about me blocking a neighbor's right-of-way and unlawfully detaining him on his property. Shocked, James apparently told them I was preventing him from leaving his land unless he joined me in a private agreement. That was false, and I showed the officers the relevant deed sections, property boundary lines, and explained that James had a fully functional, albeit longer, road to the main highway. No one physically trapped him. Drive around if he wanted. Just more inconvenient. I said I had a county map of the limited easement. I told the officers James could cross my corner if he made a respectful arrangement. I no longer felt comfortable giving him unmonitored anytime access due to his escalations. I think the older officer understood immediately. He carefully reviewed the documents, asked me questions, and nodded. The younger officer took notes but mostly deferred to the older one. After an hour, they thanked me for my cooperation and admitted they'd received the call under the guise of threatened bodily harm if James crossed. I could tell from their faces they didn't believe it. They probably left to talk to James. I never heard anything else about that call, but James was clearly willing to lie to the police to pressure me. I reached boiling point that night. I met with a local property dispute attorney to learn my rights and plan a strategy. My story was carefully listened to by the lawyer, a calm woman with extensive county law knowledge. She thanked me for documenting everything and said I could limit or revoke James's use if he kept harassing me. His limited easement did not allow him to use my driveway as his. She advised sending a formal cease and desist letter for the slander and false police complaint. I was reluctant to escalate, but the more I thought about it, the more I needed to stand up for myself. After all, I had spent 3 years being patient, cooperative, and open to a friendly relationship only to be stabbed in the back by rumors and false accusations. I had my lawyer write and mail an official letter stating that any further defamation would result in legal action, that my property was revoked unless given express permission, and that the police would be notified of any trespassing attempts. Relief and anxiety mingled. I didn't want war, but I wouldn't surrender. I stopped being nice when my neighbor used social pressure and law enforcement against me. 2 days after the letter arrived, Harriet, my neighbor in the next cabin down the mountain, called. By word of mouth, Harriet told me that James was furious about the legal letter and had been complaining to anyone who would listen that I was violating his rights and trying to run him off the mountain. She and a few others knew the truth, and that James's attempts to turn them against me were failing. People were starting to notice his manipulation. Harriet also said James's plan was to say I refused to join the HOA because I wanted revenge on the community, even though it was out of bounds. Harriet warned me despite the absurd logic. If James kept twisting the story, he would try something else. I became proactive. That weekend, I hosted a barbecue for Harriet and a few other neutral or friendly neighbors. I wanted them to see that I wasn't a crazy recluse, but a regular person who valued neighborliness. A retiree couple from across the valley, a new family with a toddler, and Harriet were among the 5 who arrived. We enjoyed grilling burgers, playing yard games, and discussing local issues in the afternoon. They weren't part of the HOA because their properties, like mine, were outside its jurisdiction. James and I briefly discussed my situation. Everyone sympathized, and some complained about the HOA's tenacity. The gathering was a good morale boost because I showed people who I was and they realized James's stories might be false. 1 week later, the story changed slightly. I answered the phone early one morning to hear Lyle's voice. He said he heard about my letter to James and wanted to understand my perspective. I was surprised and suspicious, but agreed to meet him at a nearby coffee shop. After we sat down, he asked about the property line, the previous owner's arrangement, and whether I wanted to revoke James's access. I answered honestly and admitted James had lied to the police, spread rumors, and gone behind my back. Lyle seemed surprised, like he didn't understand James's actions. He told me James had approached the HOA board, claiming I had built a fence blocking his only route and was trying to extort him. Lyle said he initially believed James, but after hearing my side, he doubted him. His next question shocked me. Would you consider joining the HOA if James publicly apologized and the board agreed to supervise easement use? A bitter laugh escaped me. After everything, you want me to pay membership dues to formalize a road-sharing agreement? No, I refused. My property was legally outside their district, so joining was pointless. Lyle was told that if James apologized and changed his behavior, I would consider letting him cross again under a private neighbor-to-neighbor agreement. But he could no longer come and go without consequence. Lyle nodded and said he respected that position, but he wasn't happy. Before leaving, he suggested I consider the bigger picture of community harmony. I told him it should have started with James not smearing my name. A brief lull occurred. James remained silent. I occasionally saw his car slowly weaving down the bumpy mountain back road, likely to and from the highway. He never returned to my property. I cleaned up the disputed corner and added a post and hinged gate to clarify the boundary. Instead of locking it, I put a latch on it so I or someone else could open it in an emergency. I wanted no roadblocks for the fire department or ambulance if they needed to get through. In case James claimed I was building walls or barricades to trap him, I took dated photos of the gate installation. The quiet confrontation changed everything. James drove up in his truck just shy of my property line one afternoon while I was clearing fallen branches by the gate. I felt uneasy. He exited and came over. I anticipated a heated argument, but he appeared exhausted, maybe even sorry. Look, I know we've had our differences. Please know that I won't pursue this. Though stunned, I saw no sincerity in his eyes. His apology felt more like acknowledging he'd lost a battle than apologizing for everything. He said he would keep taking the back road and hoped I would change my mind about letting him cross. He muttered about the HOA, saying they disappointed him, and left. The conversation lasted under a minute. I wondered what changed. Perhaps Lyle or someone else revealed that I had legal counsel and enough evidence to sue him. James may have decided it wasn't worth it. Regardless, it appeared to be a resolution, or ceasefire. There was more to the story. While James's personal vendetta against me seemed to die down, the HOA had bigger problems. I heard their board wanted to expand the HOA to include all properties at the top of the mountain, a clear cash grab. Some people on the outskirts of the existing boundary were alarmed, including me, even though I was far away. The local news station reported that the HOA was asking the county commissioners to redraw lines. Whether I liked it or not, the measure could force me in. The gall was unbelievable. Again, I contacted my attorney, who explained that HOA expansions require multiple approvals, and property owners can object. She assured me that forcing independent properties was typically difficult. It became a major subplot in my life. In public comment at a county commissioners meeting, I explained that my land was never developed. Mountain living has unique challenges, such as the steep driveway and limited road. I also disclosed that I had never received HOA services or funding. Many of my neighbors voiced similar concerns. The county commissioners denied the petition, citing insufficient justification for forcibly expanding. That was a relief, but the whole thing was scary. I learned a lot about local politics then. Lyle kept pushing the idea that if we all joined the HOA, we could lobby the county for better road maintenance. A quick investigation revealed that the county maintained our area's main roads and that private owners maintained the smaller roads to remote properties, including mine. No matter how the HOA or Lyle spun it, it was impractical. The petition's failure was a victory for me and every homeowner who valued independence and didn't want to pay extra for minor benefits. James's behavior changed strangely. I saw him standing near the property line several times, looking at the new gate and possibly contemplating what happened. However, he never approached me again and seemed more reserved. I heard from neighbors that he was spending less time on the mountain and considered selling. I didn't know how much was true, but I wouldn't be surprised if he felt shame or realized he couldn't bully me. I did feel some satisfaction when I discovered that James's false police report that I was detaining him had backfired. The local police dropped the case after finding no evidence. They noted that the complaint was unsubstantiated, and in some jurisdictions, repeatedly filing false police reports can result in legal action. James may have been warned. A mutual acquaintance said James's attempts to involve law enforcement in a minor HOA dispute hurt his relationship with them. I took comfort in the fact that a few locals saw me as the calm one in the mess. I was invited to casual gatherings and made friends with some of the more laid-back neighbors who, like me, preferred quiet to organized, rule-bound community life. We became close friends because Harriet liked gardening and shared tips and produce. The retired couple who attended my barbecue sometimes stopped by for coffee and sunset from my deck. It was nice to have a sense of community without a HOA board dictating how we should live. Just in case, I kept meticulous records. The gate stood. The latch remained unlocked for emergencies, but only I and my close friends needed to go through. That was the best compromise, according to my attorney, to maintain a strong legal position. James could open the latch or call me in an emergency, so I never blocked him. However, I wasn't letting him or his guests trample my property whenever they wanted. A letter arrived 6 months after the police incident. I thought it was another official notice or sneaky legal threat. When I opened it, I saw that it was from a local mediator's office and that James had requested mediation to resolve ongoing disputes about the easement. I compared pros and cons. Part of me wanted to ignore it. As a cheaper and more amicable alternative to court, mediation may be a good idea. I asked the mediator what James wanted out of curiosity. James worried that restricted access would deter buyers if he sold his property. He thought a mutual easement agreement would help him sell his place. He was hostile, so I was wary. Still, I attended one session to see if a fair arrangement that recognized my rights and gave him limited crossing privileges was possible. James arrived alone and nervous. I brought my lawyer. After a calm start, the mediator realized James hadn't changed as much as I hoped. He maintained that he had a right to cross, that the new arrangement should be permanent, and that I couldn't revoke it regardless of his behavior. My lawyer argued that I had the right to control my land and that any future use should be conditioned on respect and possibly a maintenance fee if the road was to be maintained. It was clear we were stuck. James wanted everything, and I had no reason to give him more than the law required. Session ended without resolution. The mediator requested another meeting, but I declined. "Look, you burned the bridge when you spread rumors and lied to the police," I told James as we packed up. "I won't give you an indefinite pass." He nodded grudgingly, and we parted ways. Normalcy returned after that. Snow covered the mountains in winter. I had to buy a snowblower for my driveway, which was an adventure, but I managed the heavy snowfall. James's property was up the hill, and I occasionally saw him slowly plowing that back mountain road, probably cursing the extra time and effort. I didn't gloat. I just wanted to live peacefully, even if it meant he had to work harder. Public perception changed during a Valley Holiday Festival. The community outreach sheriff recognized me from when they came to my house. He made conversation and politely asked if my neighbor's issues were resolved. As I summarized the mediator attempt, he shook his head in mild disbelief. He then admitted that James's behavior had been counterproductive. He didn't say how, but I thought James had cried wolf too often with local authorities. Yes, I thanked him for his concern, and that was it. However, it proved I wasn't the troublemaker. Soon after the festival, Harriet brought a tin of homemade cookies. She told me over coffee that James may sell his property soon. Harriet said, "He found out that up here, people won't always do what you say just because you throw a tantrum." I laughed that another neighbor was tired of dealing with me and wanted to move somewhere less isolated. He could leave if he wanted, but I wondered how he would explain the limited easement to buyers. A few weeks later, a "for sale" sign appeared near his driveway. I wasn't happy, but relieved. If he sold the house, I could get along with the next tenant if they treated me with respect. James listed the property as a quaint mountain retreat with direct access to the main road, which was misleading. He probably wanted to keep the listing vague so buyers wouldn't ask many questions until later. In the meantime, the HOA seemed less interested in me. Their expansion attempt had failed, Lyle hadn't returned, and life was almost back to the peaceful life I envisioned when I bought the cabin. I worked on my workshop, learned advanced woodworking techniques, and sold some custom pieces online. I also started hiking more, exploring mountain trails and forgetting about the neighborly drama that had consumed so much of my time. James vanished a month after the for sale sign went up. I didn't see his truck, and neighbors thought he moved to the valley while selling his cabin. Pending sale appeared, then sold a few days later. I never saw James again. Part of me was glad. Another part was annoyed that he never apologized for the headaches. Several weeks later, a husband and wife arrived in a pickup truck full of boxes as the new owners. While unloading furniture, they introduced themselves. They were friendly and asked about local utilities, snow plowing, and the best markets. It was inevitable that easement came up. They were worried about it after seeing it in the property disclosures. They also said the realtor explained that the previous owner wasn't on good terms with me and hoped to improve. They denied launching an invasion of my land. It was my property, so they respected it. I was relieved and told them to let me know if they needed the short route in an emergency. No tension, argument, or endless HOA demands. We just exchanged phone numbers. In subsequent months, these neighbors were delightful. Sometimes we shared firewood or helped with odd jobs. They never pressured me to join an association, and I never lectured them on the mountain's back road. They took that route most of the time. But during storms or rock slides, they'd politely ask to cross, and I'd say, of course, as long as they respected the property. It was exactly the neighborly arrangement I wanted from the start. After everything happened, I learned to stand up for myself, understand local laws, and not let pushy neighbors bully me. I appreciate the kind people who helped me, the local attorney who made sure I knew my rights, and the law enforcement officers who saw through James's lies. I kept my property from being absorbed into a HOA I didn't want, and kept control over that vital land. The lesson from this is not to be intimidated by power or influence claims. With knowledge and evidence, you can protect your property. Mountain living has its drawbacks, but it also offers stunning views, genuine community, and peace you won't find in a city. Since James is gone, I've found peace and won't let it go. My neighbor tried calling the police when I refused to join his treasured HOA. It became a year-long nightmare. Standing firm paid off. This hidden cabin, a small workshop, and a corner of land worth more than its square footage are still mine. It shows that bullying doesn't always work, and that sometimes the best revenge is living well with your rights intact, free from control seekers. Friends, thank you. See you soon.